on the call script. Fire, crack, fire!
7 days ago, 4 astronauts climbed into a spacecraft named Integrity and left Earth. Right now, as you watch this, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen are closer to the moon than any human being has been in over half a century. And every single system keeping them alive was paid for in blood. Not money, not time, blood. Human lives, decades of them. The road to Artemis II is not paved with triumph. It is paved with coffins. We don't talk about this enough. We celebrate launches. We share the photographs of Earth shrinking in the cabin window. We watch the countdowns and cheer. But behind every successful mission is a graveyard of lessons that were only learned because someone died first. Artemis II did not begin on April 1st, 2026. It began on a January evening in 1967, in a sealed capsule filled with pure oxygen, when 3 men burned alive on a launch pad in Florida. Gus Grissom was a veteran. He had flown in Mercury. He had commanded the first Gemini mission. He was, by every measure, one of the most experienced astronauts NASA had. Ed White was the first American to walk in space. A man who loved being outside his spacecraft so much that Mission Control had to order him back inside. Roger Chaffee was the rookie, the youngest of the 3, 31 years old, a naval aviator who had never been to space, but had spent years preparing for the moment he finally would. On January 27, 1967, the 3 of them were sealed inside the Apollo 1 command module at Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy, running a routine countdown simulation. They were not going to space that day. They were practicing. The spacecraft was pressurized with pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure, a decision that in hindsight turned their capsule into a bomb waiting for a spark. The problems started early.
Communications were so bad that Grissom, frustrated, said over the radio the following statement.
How are we gonna get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings?
That if they couldn't talk between 2 buildings, how were they supposed to communicate between Earth and the moon? The test dragged on. Holds piled up. And then, at 6:31 in the evening, a spark from a frayed wire beneath Grissom's seat found the oxygen. Pure oxygen does not burn the way normal air does. It detonates. In that environment, materials that would barely smolder in regular atmosphere, nylon netting, Velcro strips, foam padding, erupted into an inferno. Roger Chaffee's voice came over the radio. Then silence. Ed White tried to open the hatch. It was designed with 6 bolts that required a ratchet to open, one at a time from the inside. Under normal conditions, this took about 90 seconds. Under these conditions, with the internal pressure rising, the cabin filling with smoke and flame, it was impossible. The hatch was designed to keep the astronauts safely inside. On January 27th, it kept them trapped. 27 technicians on the pad rushed to help and were driven back by heat and smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. By the time they got the hatch open, 5 minutes after Chaffee's first call, all 3 men were dead. The medical examiner determined they died of asphyxiation from toxic gases. Their suits had melted and fused to the cabin interior. It took 6 hours before anyone could begin removing their bodies. The investigation that followed identified over 1,400 safety problems with the Apollo spacecraft. 1,400. The pure oxygen atmosphere, the flammable materials inside the cabin, the hatch design, the wiring quality. North American Aviation, the contractor that built the capsule, had known about many of these issues. NASA had known about some of them too. Gus Grissom himself had been so frustrated with the spacecraft's quality that his crew posed for a mock portrait with their heads bowed in prayer, hands clasped, and sent it to the program manager with an inscription that read, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." He was joking, and then he was dead. NASA shut down crewed Apollo flights for 20 months. They redesigned the hatch so it could be opened in seconds. They replaced the cabin atmosphere with a nitrogen and oxygen mix during ground tests. They stripped out every flammable material they could find. They rebuilt the spacecraft from the inside out. Gene Kranz, the flight director, gathered his team after the fire and told them something that became a kind of creed. "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we blocked out all the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we."
2 years later, Apollo 11 landed on the Moon. The command module that carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins safely through re-entry and splashdown was a direct descendant of the lessons written in Grissom, White, and Chaffee's death. The quick release hatch, the fire-resistant materials, the wiring standards, the redesigned cabin atmosphere procedures, all of it came from that evening at Pad 34. Launch Complex 34 itself was decommissioned in 1969. Today it stands abandoned on the Cape, overgrown with weeds and wild pepper trees, slowly rusting in the Florida salt air. A faded sign reads, "Abandon in place." 3 granite benches sit at the base, 1 for each man. Every January, families and friends return to lay flowers. What connects Apollo 1 to Artemis II is not abstract. The Orion spacecraft sitting on top of that SLS rocket uses a quick-release hatch system. It uses fire-resistant interior materials. It uses a mixed gas atmosphere during ground operations. These are not coincidences. These are direct design lineages. Every one of those features exists because 3 men could not get out of a burning capsule in time. Across the Atlantic, in the Soviet Union, a parallel horror was unfolding. 3 months after the Apollo 1 fire, on April 24, 1967, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die during a space mission. His Soyuz 1 spacecraft had been plagued with problems from the moment it reached orbit. One of its solar panels failed to deploy. The attitude control system malfunctioned. The spacecraft tumbled. Komarov fought the vehicle for over a day, trying to stabilize it, trying to align it for re-entry. He succeeded, barely. The spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere, and then the main parachute failed. Soyuz 1 slammed into the ground at roughly 40 meters per second. Komarov was killed on impact. When the recovery team arrived, they found a charred mass of metal. His remains were barely identifiable. The investigation revealed that the parachute container had been improperly manufactured. The interior walls were too rough, coated with a polymerizing substance that should have been smooth, and the parachute lines snagged as they tried to deploy. The backup parachute tangled with the partially deployed main. Engineers had warned that the spacecraft was not ready. Over 200 technical problems had been documented before launch. Quality control inspectors had flagged concerns. None of it mattered. Political pressure, the desire to stage a dramatic dual spacecraft rendezvous to coincide with a national celebration, pushed the mission forward anyway. Komarov reportedly knew he was likely going to die. Gagarin, his friend and his backup pilot, had tried to bump him from the flight, reasoning that the Soviet leadership would never risk the life of the world's most famous cosmonaut and would cancel the mission entirely. But the scheme didn't work. When colleagues asked Komarov why he didn't simply refuse to fly, his answer was devastating in its simplicity. If he refused, Gagarin would go in his place. He would not let his friend die for him. So he climbed into a spacecraft he knew was broken. He orbited the Earth for over a day while systems failed around him. And when the parachute didn't open, he fell. Gagarin died 11 months later in a jet crash. He was 34. 4 years later, the Soviets suffered their worst spaceflight disaster. On June 30th, 1971, cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev were returning to Earth after spending 22 days aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station. They had broken every endurance record in the book. As their Soyuz 11 descent module separated from the orbital module, a pressure equalization valve opened prematurely. At an altitude of 168 kilometers, still firmly in the vacuum of space, the air inside their capsule began bleeding out. They were not wearing pressure suits. The Soyuz spacecraft had been designed to carry 3 cosmonauts, but only if they wore no suits, because the cabin was too small to fit 3 suited men. This was a known compromise, a weight saving, a gamble. The valve was hidden beneath the cosmonauts' seats. There's evidence they tried to find and close it manually, a process that would have taken several minutes even under ideal conditions. They had less than 1. Within 30 seconds of the valve opening, the cabin pressure dropped to near vacuum. They lost consciousness. Within 2 minutes, they were dead. The capsule continued its descent in fully automatic mode. The parachute deployed. It landed softly in Kazakhstan, exactly as planned. When the recovery team opened the hatch, expecting to greet 3 triumphant space explorers, they found 3 dead men still strapped in their seats, blue-faced, silent. The resuscitation attempts were futile. The entire Soviet space program halted for 2 years. When they resumed flights, cosmonauts wore pressure suits during launch and re-entry. Always, no exceptions. The Soyuz was redesigned to carry only 2 cosmonauts instead of 3, creating enough room for both men to wear full pressure suits. That requirement persists to this day, across every crewed spacecraft on Earth, including Orion. The suits that the Artemis II crew wore during their launch 4 days ago, the Orion Crew Survival System suits, they demonstrated again today as the spacecraft approaches the Moon. Those suits exist because of Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev. Because 3 men suffocated in the silence of space, while a valve the size of a coin bled their atmosphere into nothing. On August 2nd, 1971, about a month after the Soyuz 11 funeral, Apollo 15 astronauts David Scott and James Irwin placed a small aluminium figurine and a plaque on the surface of the Moon at the Hadley Apennine landing site. The plaque listed the names of 14 astronauts and cosmonauts who had died in the pursuit of space exploration. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev were on it. So were Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Americans and Soviets side by side on the Moon. It is still there. Then came the shuttles. January 28, 1986. Space Shuttle Challenger,
7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, who had been selected from over 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian in space. Millions of schoolchildren were watching the launch live, many in their classrooms. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart. The cause was an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. The morning was unusually cold at Cape Canaveral, and the rubber seals had stiffened in the low temperatures, losing the flexibility they needed to maintain a tight seal between booster segments. Hot combustion gas leaked through the failed seal, burned through the external fuel tank, and the vehicle disintegrated. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that manufactured the boosters, had warned NASA the night before that the O-rings might not perform in the cold. They recommended delaying the launch. NASA managers pushed back. The engineers were overruled. The launch proceeded. Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe. 7 names, 7 people. The investigation afterward found that the crew cabin survived the initial breakup largely intact. At least some of the crew were conscious after the vehicle broke apart. Emergency oxygen packs had been activated. The cabin fell for 2.5 minutes before hitting the Atlantic Ocean at roughly 320 kilometers per hour. That impact was not survivable. The Rogers Commission that investigated the disaster found that the decision to launch was fundamentally flawed, rooted in what they called a normalization of deviance. O-ring erosion had been observed on previous flights. Rather than treat it as a warning, NASA treated it as acceptable risk because previous flights had landed safely. Each successful landing with damaged O-rings made the damage seem more normal, until the morning it killed 7 people. NASA created an entirely new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance. They redesigned the solid rocket boosters. They implemented escape systems. They required crew members to wear pressure suits during ascent and re-entry, something the Shuttle program had initially abandoned to make the flights feel more routine. The Shuttle was supposed to make space travel feel like catching a flight from JFK to London. Challenger proved it was nothing like that. It never was. It never will be. 17 years later, almost to the day, the pattern repeated itself. February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia. During launch, a piece of insulating foam detached from the external tank and struck the leading edge of the orbiter's left wing, punching a hole in the reinforced carbon panels that protected the shuttle during re-entry. Engineers on the ground noticed the foam strike. Some raised concerns. Management concluded the debris was unlikely to cause serious damage, partly because foam strikes had occurred on previous missions without catastrophe. The same logic, the same normalization, the same refusal to treat a recurring anomaly as the emergency it was. 16 days later, Columbia re-entered the atmosphere. During those 16 days, the crew had conducted over 80 experiments in microgravity. They had no idea the wing was compromised. Engineers on the ground had requested satellite imagery to assess the damage, but the request was turned down by management, who saw no need for it. One engineering team even prepared a contingency plan in case the damage was severe, exploring whether the crew could shelter in place aboard the International Space Station. That plan was never formally evaluated. Nobody in a position to act believed the foam could have caused critical damage. Superheated gas entered through the hole in the wing during re-entry. At first, it was just a temperature anomaly in the sensor data, a few degrees warmer than expected in the left wheel well. Within minutes, the internal structure melted. The wing collapsed. The orbiter broke apart over Texas and Louisiana
at 60 kilometers altitude. Debris rained down across 2 states. Over 82,000 pieces were eventually recovered, totaling about 38% of the vehicle's dry weight. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, an Israeli fighter pilot and the first Israeli astronaut. 7 more names. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board published a damning conclusion. NASA had failed to learn the lessons of Challenger. The organizational culture that allowed known risks to be redefined as acceptable had not been fixed. It had survived 17 years and killed 7 more people. The board wrote that the causes of the 2 disasters were, at their root, identical. The Shuttle program eventually ended in 2011 after 135 missions. 14 astronauts dead across 2 catastrophic failures. And in the ashes of those failures, the next generation of spacecraft began to take shape. Congress mandated the development of a new launch system. Engineers at NASA and its contractors started designing what would become the Space Launch System and the Orion capsule. The SLS uses solid rocket boosters derived from the Shuttle's boosters, but redesigned with the lessons of Challenger's O-ring failure built into every joint. The RS-25 engines on the core stage are the same engine design that powered the Shuttle orbiters, refined and improved over decades of operation. The heat shield on Orion, the one that will protect the Artemis II crew when they slam back into Earth's atmosphere at over 40,000 kilometers per hour in 5 days, is an ablative shield specifically designed to avoid the tile-based vulnerability that destroyed Columbia. When Artemis I flew uncrewed in 2022, the heat shield performed well overall, but engineers discovered unexpected erosion in the ablative material, sections where the protective coating wore away more than models predicted. This was a problem. Rather than ignore it, rather than normalize it the way NASA had normalized phone strikes, the program paused. Engineers investigated. They adjusted the re-entry profile for Artemis II, changing the trajectory to reduce the stresses on the shield. They delayed the mission. They rolled the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building to fix a helium issue. They ran additional tests. The launch slipped from late 2024 to September 2025 to February 2026 to April 2026. Each delay was criticized. Each delay cost money. And each delay was the direct result of a space agency that had learned, through the deaths of 21 people, that schedule pressure kills. That is the invisible inheritance of Artemis II. Not just the hardware, not just the hatch designs and the pressure suits and the heat shield materials. The culture. The willingness to stop and fix the problem, even when the political pressure is enormous, even when the budget is bleeding, even when the public is impatient. That willingness was purchased at the highest possible price. There are names most people don't know. Valentin Bondarenko, a Soviet cosmonaut trainee who died in March 1961, just weeks before Gagarin's historic flight, when fire broke out in a pressurized oxygen chamber during an endurance test. He was 24 years old. His death was covered up by the Soviet government for decades. Theodore Freeman, a NASA astronaut killed in 1964 when a goose struck his T-38 jet trainer during a routine flight, shattering the canopy and flaming out both engines. Charles Bassett and Elliot C., the original crew of Gemini 9, killed in a jet crash in 1966 while approaching the McDonnell plant in St. Louis in bad weather. Clifton Williams, killed in a T-38 crash in 1967. Robert Lawrence, the first African-American astronaut, killed in an F-104 crash the same year. Michael Adams, who died when his X-15 went into an uncontrollable spin and disintegrated at 65,000 feet. Michael Alsbury, the co-pilot of Spaceship Two, killed in 2014 when the vehicle's feathering mechanism deployed prematurely during a powered test flight. These names rarely appear in the headlines. They don't have memorial ceremonies broadcast on national television. But each one of them contributed something to the body of knowledge that keeps astronauts alive today. Each death was a data point in the ongoing, painful education of the human species in how to leave its home planet without dying. Every ejection seat protocol, every flight envelope restriction, every crew escape system that has been refined over the decades carries the fingerprints of someone who ran out of altitude, speed, or time. And then there are the people whose names we will never know. On October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, an R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile exploded on the launch pad during pre-launch testing. The blast and the ensuing fire killed around 120 people, military personnel and civilian engineers, including Marshal Mitrofan Nedalin, the commander of the Soviet rocket forces, who had been sitting just 20 meters from the rocket to pressure his teams to work faster. The Soviet government classified the entire disaster for decades. Another explosion at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in 1980 killed 48 more. These were not astronauts. They were the technicians, the welders, the propellant handlers, the people who built the machines and fueled them and tightened the bolts. Their names are not on any memorial that most Americans would recognize, but they are part of this story too. Every piece of ground safety infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center, every fueling procedure, every blast radius calculation, descends from lessons learned in fires and explosions that killed workers whose only ambition was to do their job and go home. As of this moment, 791 people have traveled to space. 19 of them died doing it. That is a fatality rate of 2.4%. If you include ground tests, training flights, and preparation accidents, the number climbs past 30. If you count the ground crew and civilians killed in launch accidents, the unacknowledged technicians, the unnamed workers at Baikonur and Cape Canaveral, and facilities across the world who were vaporized in explosions or poisoned by propellant leaks, the number reaches well past 150. Right now, somewhere over the void between the Earth and the Moon, 4 people are alive inside a capsule designed to keep them breathing in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in about 15 seconds. They will fly around the far side of the Moon, farther from home than any human has traveled since December 1972. They will see things that only 24 people in all of history have ever seen with their own eyes. The launch abort system above their capsule, the one that would yank them free of the rocket in a fraction of a second if something went catastrophically wrong during ascent, works because of Apollo 1. The pressure suits they are wearing exist because of Soyuz 11. The solid rocket booster joints beneath them were redesigned because of Challenger. The heat shield beneath their feet was stress-tested with extra caution because of Columbia. The culture that delayed their launch 3 times to fix problems, rather than fly with known risks, was forged in the deaths of 21 astronauts and cosmonauts who were not as lucky. Artemis II did not begin 6 days ago on a launch pad in Florida. It began in a burning capsule at Pad 34. It began in a crater in the Russian steppe where a cosmonaut hit the ground because his parachute would not open. It began in a depressurized cabin where 3 men turned blue and silent while their spacecraft landed perfectly. It began 73 seconds into a cold January morning when 7 people, including a schoolteacher, fell from the sky. It began when foam nobody took seriously punched a hole in a wing nobody checked. It began in classified explosions at Soviet cosmodromes that killed workers whose names were erased from public record. It began every time a test pilot climbed into a jet, knowing the margins were thin and the consequences were permanent. The crew named their Orion spacecraft Integrity. They chose the name, they said, to honor the trust between the people making the mission possible. Over 300,000 individual components were integrated into a single vehicle by teams working across the globe. But integrity also means wholeness, completeness. The spacecraft is whole because every crack, every failure, every catastrophe in the history of human spaceflight has been stitched into its design. It carries the scar tissue of 60 years of trial and death and trial again. Those are the people who built Artemis II. Not with their hands, with their deaths. And the only way to honor them is to remember that every safety protocol, every redundant system, every delayed launch, every conservative engineering decision that brings those 4 astronauts home alive is a monument to someone who did not come home. Grissom once said, after his Gemini 3 mission in 1965, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We are in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program." The conquest of space is worth the risk of life. Less than 2 years later, he was gone. But the program did not stop. It changed. And because it changed, 4 people are alive tonight, 300,000 kilometers from home, flying toward the moon inside a spacecraft built on everything we learned from losing them. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.